I was sitting in a leather chair in the waiting room of Whitfield and Associates, watching a receptionist water a plant that clearly didn't need watering, when my phone buzzed with my brother's name on the screen, and I almost didn't answer it, because some part of me already suspected what this call was going to be. I answered anyway. "Well, I hope you're sitting down," Ryan said, without so much as a hello, his voice carrying the specific, barely contained triumph of someone who has been waiting to deliver a piece of news for the sheer pleasure of delivering it. "I just got off the phone with the lawyer. Grandpa left everything to me. The house, the accounts, all of it. You get nothing, Claire. Not a single dime." I sat there for a moment, in that leather chair, in that waiting room, 3 walls of framed diplomas away from a lawyer's office. I had a 10 o'clock appointment within exactly 6 minutes, and I felt something in my chest that was not, to my own surprise, panic or grief or even particularly surprise. It was something closer to a strange, quiet stillness, the sensation of watching a piece fall exactly where you expected it to fall. "Okay," I said. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the specific silence of someone who has rehearsed a scene in their head and is now confused that the other person hasn't read their lines correctly. "Okay," Ryan repeated. "That's it. That's all you have to say." "I heard you," I said. "I have to go, Ryan. I'll talk to you later." I hung up before he could say anything else, and I sat there for a moment longer, phone in my lap, aware of the receptionist glancing at me with the mild, professional curiosity of someone who overhears a lot of tense phone calls in a waiting room like this one and has learned not to ask questions. I need to explain who I am, and who Ryan is, and who our grandfather was, because none of what just happened on that phone call makes sense without the 2.5 years that came before it. My name is Claire. I was 31 years old, and my grandfather, Walter Hensley, had died 6 weeks earlier, 4 days after his 88th birthday, in the bedroom of the house he'd lived in for 51 years, with me sitting beside his bed holding his hand, because that was where I had been, more nights than not, for the better part of the previous 2 years. Grandpa Walter had raised me for a significant stretch of my childhood. My parents had divorced when I was 6, my mother had struggled with what I understand now, as an adult, to have been a fairly serious depression, and there had been a period of about 3 years, between ages 7 and 10, when I effectively lived with my grandparents more than I lived with either of my actual parents. My grandmother had been alive then, warm and constant, and between the two of them I had gotten something that felt, despite the circumstances, remarkably like a stable childhood. My grandmother died when I was 19. Grandpa Walter never really recovered from it in the full sense. He kept living, kept functioning, kept showing up to family dinners and birthdays with his particular dry humor mostly intact, but something in him had permanently dimmed, and I think everyone in the family understood this without ever quite saying it out loud. Ryan is 2 years older than me, and his relationship with our grandparents had always been different from mine, not hostile, not estranged exactly, but characterized by a specific, consistent distance that I don't think he was ever fully conscious of maintaining. He had not lived with them the way I had. He had his own household growing up, our father's second marriage, a childhood that had proceeded along more conventional lines than mine, and I think, as a result, he had simply never developed the same bone-deep attachment to our grandparents that circumstance had built into me. This isn't to say Ryan didn't love Grandpa Walter. I believe he did, in the loose, uncomplicated way you love a relative you see at holidays. But love, in Ryan's case, had never once translated into time. He visited perhaps 4 or 5 times a year, called on birthdays, sent a card at Christmas, and considered his obligations, as far as I could tell, fully discharged by these gestures. I moved back into Grandpa Walter's house 2 years before he died, when a fall in his kitchen, a broken hip, a 6-week hospital stay, a recovery that made clear he could not safely live alone anymore, forced a decision the family had been avoiding. I remember the conversation, a family meeting at Ryan's house, where the question of what came next had been raised, and where Ryan had suggested, with what he clearly believed was reasonable practicality, that we look into assisted living facilities, a suggestion I had opposed immediately and, I'll admit, somewhat fiercely, Because I had grown up in that house and could not stomach the idea of my grandfather living out his final years in a facility while it sat empty. I had a flexible remote job. I did not have children, did not have a partner at the time. I was, of the two of us, unambiguously the one positioned to actually take this on, and so I did. I moved back into the house I'd grown up partially in, into my old bedroom, and became, for the next 2 years, the person who managed Grandpa Walter's medications, drove him to his cardiology appointments, cooked his meals, sat with him through the long, difficult stretches of illness that marked the last chapter of most elderly lives, and was there, at the end, holding his hand in a bedroom I had once slept in as a child. Ryan visited during those 2 years roughly as often as he always had. He came for Thanksgiving both years. He came for Grandpa's birthday. He called, occasionally, to ask how things were going, conversations that rarely lasted more than 10 minutes and rarely, in my recollection, included a single question about how I myself was holding up under the specific, grinding weight of full-time caregiving. The funeral had been 3 weeks after Grandpa Walter died, a modest service, the way he'd have wanted it, attended by the small remaining circle of his own generation and the somewhat larger gathering of ours. Ryan had given a eulogy that was, I'll admit, genuinely well-written and delivered with real emotion, a fact that had struck me, sitting in the front pew, as its own particular kind of strange, that grief and true intimacy are not always the same thing, that a person can cry sincerely at a funeral for someone they never actually took the time to know. I had not cried during my own turn at the podium. I had gotten through 3 sentences about the man who taught me to drive in the church parking lot on Sunday afternoons before my voice had simply stopped working, and I had sat back down, and my aunt had held my hand for the rest of the service, and I remember thinking, distantly, that there was something almost obscene about the fact that Ryan's polished eulogy was going to be what people remembered from that day. Which brings me back to that leather chair, 6 weeks later, in the waiting room of Whitfield and Associates, phone in my lap, my brother's triumphant voice still echoing in my ears. Grandpa left everything to me. You get nothing, Claire. Not a single dime. While I sat there for a 10 o'clock appointment that Ryan did not know I had, that he did not know existed, that he had no idea, calling to gloat from wherever he was standing, I was already sitting 6 feet from the office door of. The receptionist looked up. Miss Hensley. Mr. Whitfield will see you now. I put my phone in my bag, stood up, smoothed down my blazer, and walked toward the office door with a calm I did not entirely feel but had, over 2 years of managing far harder things than this, gotten very good at projecting. Gerald Whitfield opened the folder in front of him with the unhurried precision of a man who had done this exact thing hundreds of times before, and I sat across from him with my hands folded in my lap, aware of my own heartbeat in a way I don't think I'd been since the night Grandpa Walter's breathing had first turned bad 2 years earlier. Before I read anything to you, Gerald said, I want to tell you what your grandfather told me, in his own words, when we did this update 6 months ago, because I think it matters more than the legal language itself. He said, and I wrote this down almost verbatim because I could tell he wanted it remembered accurately, Claire gave me 2 years of her life when she didn't have to. Ryan gave me 4 visits a year and a phone call every couple of weeks. I love them both. But I'm not going to pretend those were the same thing, and I'm not going to let my estate pretend it either. I felt something tighten in my throat, and I did not trust myself to speak, so I simply nodded for him to continue. The will, as Gerald walked me through it over the following 20 minutes, was not the simple, absolute cutout that Ryan's gloating phone call had implied. Grandpa Walter had not, in fact, left everything to Ryan. What he had actually done was considerably more specific and considerably more pointed than either of us had expected. The house I had lived in for 2 years, the house where I'd grown up during those childhood years with my grandparents, the house where I'd held his hand as he died, had been left to me outright, along with its contents, a decision Gerald noted Grandpa Walter had been entirely unambiguous about, citing, in the will's language itself, my granddaughter Claire's 2 years of daily care, without which I would not have been able to remain in this home at all. The financial accounts, a sum that, Gerald indicated, added up to just over $600,000 across various investments and savings, had been split according to a formula Grandpa Walter had apparently spent real time considering: 60% to me, 40% to Ryan, with a specific clause explaining the division was not a punishment, but a recognition of an imbalance in care that a 50-50 split would have ignored. There was also, Gerald told me, a smaller and more particular provision: a piece of lakefront property Grandpa Walter had owned for decades, a modest cabin neither Ryan nor I had visited more than a handful of times as adults, which had been left to Ryan outright, along with a note, read into the will's language, that said, "I want Ryan to have something that is entirely his, so that whatever he feels about the rest of this, he knows I did not forget him." I sat with all of this for a long moment after Gerald finished reading, and what I felt, more than anything else, was the specific, aching accuracy of it, that my grandfather had thought about this with more care and more fairness than the phone call I'd received an hour earlier had led me to expect, that he had found a way to honor what I'd given him without erasing Ryan entirely, and that Ryan, calling to gloat about inheriting everything, had either been given inaccurate information or had simply decided, on his own, to characterize a 40% share and a cabin as total victory and total exclusion of me. "Does Ryan know the actual terms?" I asked. Gerald's expression shifted slightly, something careful and diplomatic crossing his face. "I spoke with him briefly this morning, before you arrived, because he called my office directly and was quite insistent. I told him I couldn't discuss specifics over the phone and that a formal reading would happen once both of you had met with me individually first, per your grandfather's instructions. I suspect," he added, "that your brother may have drawn some conclusions of his own, based on receiving the house deed reference, which does list your name, and choosing not to wait for the rest of the explanation." I understood, sitting there, exactly what had happened. Ryan had likely gotten a partial, garbled piece of information, perhaps a clerk mentioning the house going to me, without context, without the fuller picture of his own 40% and the cabin, and had spun it, in the space of a single phone call, into the version he delivered to me with such triumph: "Everything to me, nothing to you." Whether this was a genuine misunderstanding or something closer to a story he decided to tell himself and me both, I honestly couldn't say with certainty, not yet. Gerald had scheduled a joint meeting for the following week, both Ryan and me, together, so that the actual terms could be read aloud in a setting where no partial version could take root and grow into a grievance neither of us could later walk back. I called Ryan that evening. "I met with Gerald today," I said. "Oh, so now you want to talk," he said, and I could hear, underneath the sarcasm, something rawer, the sound of a man who had spent the day building a narrative and was now bracing for it to be complicated. "He scheduled us both for next Tuesday. Together. He wants to read the actual terms to both of us at the same time." There was a pause. "What do you mean, actual terms?" "You already know something I don't." "I know what he told me today," I said carefully. "I think you should hear it from Gerald directly, the way Grandpa wanted, instead of from me secondhand. Claire." His voice had shifted, the triumph of the morning call fully gone now, replaced with something closer to genuine anxiety. "Just tell me. Did he leave you more than the house? Is that what this is?" I told him I'd see him Tuesday. The following Tuesday, we sat in Gerald's office together, the first time Ryan and I had been in the same room since the funeral, 6 weeks earlier, and I watched my brother's face as Gerald read through the same terms he'd walked me through the week before: the house to me, the account split 60-40, the cabin to Ryan outright, the specific language about an imbalance in care. Ryan's face moved through several stages during that reading, an initial, brittle composure, then a flush of something like disbelief as the 60-40 split was read aloud, then, by the time Gerald reached the line about the cabin being given, "so he knows I did not forget him," something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine hurt breaking through the anger. "He gave her the house," Ryan said, when Gerald finished, not quite looking at either of us. "And most of the money. And I get a cabin nobody's used in 15 years. "He gave you a cabin," Gerald said, with the calm, unbothered precision of a man who had delivered variations of this exact confrontation many times before, and 40% of just over $600,000, which comes to a bit over $240,000, Ryan. That is not nothing. Your sister received a larger share because your grandfather was explicit, in writing, about why 2 years of full-time, unpaid caregiving is not a small thing to weigh against a handful of visits a year, however you might personally feel about that comparison. Ryan didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he looked at me, and the anger in his face had a specific, wounded quality to it that surprised me, given the phone call that had started all of this. You let me sit there and think I'd won something, he said. You knew, when I called you gloating like an idiot, that it wasn't true, and you just said, okay, and let me keep believing it. I said, okay, because I didn't know what to say to you in that moment, Ryan, I told him, and I meant it. The calm on that call had not been strategy, not really, it had been the simple exhaustion of a woman who had spent 2 years too tired to fight, hearing her brother gloat about something that turned out not to even be accurate. I wasn't hiding anything from you. I hadn't even had my own meeting yet when you called. I genuinely didn't know the terms until an hour after you did. He sat with that for a moment, and something in his posture deflated slightly, the anger losing some of its fuel once he understood I hadn't been quietly savoring a secret at his expense. Gerald left the two of us alone in his office for a few minutes after the reading finished, murmuring something about paperwork he needed to retrieve, a small kindness I recognized even in the moment as deliberate, giving Ryan and me space to have whatever conversation was going to happen next without an audience, even a professional one. Ryan sat in the chair across from me, turning a pen over in his hands that he must have picked up off Gerald's desk without noticing, and for a while neither of us said anything. I called you before I even had the full picture, he said eventually, not quite looking at me. The clerk mentioned the house had your name on it, and I filled in the rest myself. I decided what the rest probably was before I actually knew. You decided the worst version, I said. And then you called to tell me about it like it was good news for you. He didn't defend that. I want to note that, because I think it mattered. Ryan had many flaws that this whole ordeal had made newly visible to me, but outright dishonesty about his own behavior in that specific moment was not one of them. He sat with the accusation instead of deflecting it. I think, he said slowly, I've spent so long telling myself a story where I was as involved as you were, just in a different way, that when I heard the house goes to Claire, some part of me decided it confirmed something I was already afraid of. That everyone was going to see, eventually, what I actually was. Which was, barely there. I hadn't expected that from him. I want to be honest about that. Some part of me had walked into that follow-up conversation braced for more anger, more justification, and instead I got something that sounded, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like actual self-recognition. You weren't barely there, I said, because it felt important to say, even then. You were there for Thanksgiving. You were there for his birthday. You gave a eulogy that made the whole church cry. You loved him, Ryan. I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying love and daily presence aren't the same currency, and Grandpa knew that, and he decided the estate should reflect it. That's not him saying he loved you less. Gerald read that part too. He wanted you to have something that was entirely yours. A cabin I haven't been to since I was 19, Ryan said, but there wasn't much heat left in it. Maybe that's an invitation, I said. Not a punishment. We didn't fully resolve everything in that office, that afternoon. I don't think 2 years of a specific, accumulated imbalance gets resolved in a 20-minute conversation in a lawyer's waiting area, and I wouldn't trust a version of this story that claimed it did. But something shifted between us that day that I've come to understand, in the months since, as the actual beginning of something more honest than what we'd had before, not a relationship built on the comfortable, low-effort assumption that things were fine because no one had ever said otherwise, but one that had finally had to look directly at an imbalance neither of us had been willing to name out loud until it will force the question. The wider family's reaction, in the weeks that followed, was mixed in ways I found instructive. My aunt, who had watched the 2 years of caregiving up close, was unequivocal in her support of the terms, told me more than once that she thought Grandpa Walter had gotten it exactly right. A couple of more distant relatives, hearing a second-hand and predictably distorted version of events, murmured about fairness and equal treatment among siblings in a way that made clear they hadn't been present for a single one of those 2 a.m. hospital drives. I learned, again, the lesson I'd started learning the night of that infamous phone call, that people who weren't in the room for the actual work often have the most confident opinions about how its rewards should be divided. I did not sell the house. I want to say that clearly, because I think it matters to how this story ends. I moved into it fully, made it truly mine rather than simply the place I'd been living temporarily to care for someone else, and I have spent the better part of the year since slowly making it feel like my own home while keeping the parts of it that were unmistakably his reading chair by the window, the specific chip in the kitchen counter tile he never got around to fixing, the back porch where he told me, 2 weeks before he died, to trust him. I used a portion of my share of the accounts to pay off the last of my student loans, a specific, unglamorous form of freedom that I don't think I fully appreciated until it actually arrived. I put the rest into savings, careful and unspectacular, the way I think Grandpa Walter, a man who had never been showy with money in his life, would have wanted it handled. Ryan and I talk more now than we did before any of this happened, which is a strange thing to say about a relationship that was fractured open by a gloating phone call and a lawyer's office reading, but I think it's true, and I think it's true precisely because the fracture forced something into the open that had been quietly wrong for years. He went to the cabin, that spring, for the first time in over a decade, and sent me a photo of the lake at sunrise with a caption that just said, he had good taste. It was a small thing. It mattered more than it probably should have. I think about that phone call often, sitting in that leather chair, Ryan's voice full of a triumph that turned out to be built on incomplete information, my own strange calm in response to it. I understand now that the calm wasn't performance, wasn't strategy the way it might read in hindsight. It was simply the particular stillness of a person who had spent 2 years learning that the things worth fighting for are rarely the things people gloat about on the phone, and that grief, handled honestly, tends to reveal exactly who showed up and who didn't, with or without a will there to make it official. Grandpa Walter didn't leave me everything. He left me a house full of memory, a fair share of what he'd built, and, though I don't think he could have fully intended this particular outcome, the eventual, unlikely gift of a brother who finally had to stop assuming and start looking honestly at the 2 years I'd given that our whole family, including him, had quietly let me carry alone. That, I think, is worth more than any single dime he could have left either of us.